When the royal family gathered at Buckingham Palace that cold November morning, nobody could have predicted that a single decision would shake the very foundations of the British monarchy. Behind the grand walls where kings and queens had ruled for centuries, a quiet revolution was taking shape. Prince William, the heir to the throne, had been watching, waiting, and planning for years. Now, he was ready to make his move, and the woman at the center of his bold plan was someone few had expected to rise so high. This is the story of power, family loyalty, unexpected alliances, and the woman who went from being the shy girl from Kent to becoming the secret weapon of the British royal family. Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones grew up in a world far removed from palaces and crowns. She was born on January 20, 1965, in a quiet village called Brenchley in Kent, England. Her father was a tire salesman, and her mother worked part-time jobs to help support the family. There was nothing special about her childhood, at least not in the way that society pages would define special. She went to local schools, played with neighborhood children, and dreamed the simple dreams of any ordinary girl growing up in the English countryside. But Sophie was different in one important way. She had a natural warmth about her, a way of making people feel comfortable and heard. Her teachers noticed it. Her friends noticed it. She was the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who asked about your sick grandmother, who genuinely cared about the answer when she asked how you were doing. This gift for connection would later become her greatest asset, though she could never have imagined where it would take her. After finishing school, Sophie took a secretarial course and moved to London to find her fortune. The big city was overwhelming at first, with its crowds and noise and endless possibilities. She found work at Capital Radio, one of London's most popular stations at the time. It was there, in 1987, at a tennis event organized by a young prince, that her life would begin to change forever. The prince's name was Edward, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II, and, though they barely spoke that first meeting, something had been set in motion. Sophie threw herself into her career. She learned the business of public relations, understanding how to shape messages and manage reputations. She was good at it, very good. Her clients appreciated her discretion, her creativity, and, most importantly, her ability to stay calm under pressure. She climbed the ladder steadily, eventually opening her own public relations agency in 1996 with a business partner. RJH Public Relations became known for handling high-profile clients with grace and professionalism, a reflection of Sophie herself. But fate had other plans. Sophie and Edward crossed paths again in 1993, this time at a charity event. The years had changed them both. Edward had struggled to find his place in the royal family, trying various careers while living under the enormous shadow of his mother, the Queen. Sophie had become a confident, successful businesswoman. They started dating quietly, aware that any relationship with a royal came with enormous scrutiny and complications. Their romance unfolded slowly, carefully, over the next 5 years. Sophie learned what it meant to love someone whose every move was watched and judged by millions. She experienced the intrusive cameras, the tabloid speculation, and the constant pressure that came with being connected to the House of Windsor. Many women would have run away. Sophie stayed. She saw beyond the prince to the man, and she understood that beneath all the protocol and ceremony, Edward was someone who needed a partner who was steady, loyal, and unafraid of hard work. In January 1999, the palace announced their engagement. The ring Edward presented to Sophie was beautiful, a 2-carat oval diamond flanked by 2 heart-shaped gemstones, but the real treasure was the commitment it represented. They married on June 19, 1999, at St. George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. It was a joyous occasion, though some observers noted that Sophie was entering one of the most challenging environments imaginable. The early years of marriage brought both happiness and heartbreak. Sophie continued running her business for a time, but the demands of royal life made it increasingly difficult. There were missteps along the way, including a tabloid scandal that forced her to close her PR agency in 2002. It was a painful lesson in how unforgiving the spotlight could be. Sophie retreated from public life for a while, licking her wounds and reconsidering her future. Lesser women might have broken under the strain. Sophie emerged stronger. The birth of their daughter, Lady Louise, in 2003 was miraculous in more ways than one. Sophie suffered a placental abruption, a life-threatening complication that caused massive blood loss. She was rushed to the hospital for an emergency cesarean section. For terrifying hours, both mother and baby hovered between life and death. Edward waited in agony, praying for good news. When it finally came, when both Sophie and Louise were declared out of danger, the relief was overwhelming. This brush with mortality changed Sophie profoundly. Life suddenly seemed precious, every moment a gift not to be wasted. 4 years later, in 2007, their son James was born. The family was complete, and Sophie threw herself into motherhood with the same dedication she brought to everything else. But, unlike other royal parents, she and Edward made an unusual decision. They chose not to give their children the HRH titles they were entitled to from birth. Sophie explained their reasoning in a 2020 interview, saying they wanted to bring up their children with the understanding that they would likely have to work for a living. It was a practical, grounded approach that reflected Sophie's own upbringing and values. Meanwhile, Sophie was slowly but surely carving out her role in the royal family. She took on patronages quietly, without fanfare or publicity. She worked behind the scenes, showing up at events that rarely made the headlines but mattered enormously to the communities and charities she supported. The Queen, Elizabeth II, noticed. The monarch was known for her keen eye for character, and she saw something in Sophie that others had overlooked. A bond formed between them, grandmother and granddaughter-in-law, built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Those who knew the palace well began to whisper about this special relationship. The Queen would sometimes invite Sophie for tea, just the two of them, chatting about everything and nothing. These private moments were rare honors, gestures of trust that most members of the royal family never received. Sophie, for her part, remained humble about these meetings, never bragging or using them to advance her position. She simply appreciated being valued by someone she deeply admired. As the years passed, the royal family faced crisis after crisis. Prince Andrew's friendship with Jeffrey Epstein became a source of endless scandal and embarrassment. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle departed for America in what the press called Megxit, leaving a gaping hole in the working royal lineup. The family was shrinking, its reputation under constant assault, and the workload was becoming impossible for the remaining members to handle. Through it all, Sophie kept working. She traveled to places that other royals avoided, meeting with survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones across the world. She went to Kosovo, Sierra Leone, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Colombia. Each trip brought her face to face with unimaginable suffering, and each trip deepened her commitment to making a difference. She spoke out about what she witnessed, using her platform to draw attention to issues that the world preferred to ignore. The palace began to recognize just how valuable Sophie had become. Unlike some members of the family, she never generated negative headlines. There was no drama, no scandal, no whispered gossip about her behavior. She simply showed up, did her job, and went home to her family. In a world of celebrities and social media influencers, this quiet dedication stood out precisely because it was so rare. When King Charles III ascended to the throne following his mother's death in September 2022, the landscape shifted dramatically. Charles had long advocated for a slimmed-down monarchy, a smaller core group of working royals who would represent the crown. With Harry and Meghan gone, Andrew disgraced, and several senior royals aging, the need for reliable workers became acute. Charles looked around at his options and saw Sophie standing ready. In March 2023, Charles bestowed upon Edward the title Duke of Edinburgh, a title that had belonged to their father, Prince Philip. Sophie automatically became the Duchess of Edinburgh, a more senior position in the royal hierarchy. This was more than a name change. It was a signal that the new king saw Edward and Sophie as central to his plans for the monarchy's future. They were being elevated, given more responsibility, and trusted with representing the crown at increasingly important events. Sophie embraced her new role with characteristic energy. In September 2024 alone, she carried out 37 royal engagements, more than double the 18 she had completed in the same month the previous year. She was everywhere at once, it seemed, representing the king at military parades, meeting with foreign dignitaries, and continuing her humanitarian work. The public began to notice this blonde woman who moved through crowds with warmth and grace, who seemed genuinely interested in the people she met. But it was her relationship with the younger generation of royals that would prove most significant. Prince William had watched Sophie throughout his life. He had seen her support his grandmother, the Queen. He had observed her navigating the treacherous waters of royal life without capsizing. Most importantly, he had witnessed the kindness she showed to his wife, Catherine, during some of the most difficult moments of their lives. When Catherine was diagnosed with cancer in early 2024, the family rallied around her. But it was Sophie who provided a particular kind of comfort. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant to face a health crisis while the whole world watched. She had nearly died giving birth to Louise. She knew the fear, the uncertainty, and the desperate need for privacy during recovery. Sophie became part of Catherine's private support network, offering advice, encouragement, and the simple presence of someone who had walked a similar path. Royal watchers began describing Sophie as Catherine's royal sister, an apt description for their bond. They were both women who had married into the family from ordinary backgrounds. They both had long courtships with their princes, learning the royal ropes before taking their vows. They both prioritized their children above their public roles. And they both understood that survival in this world required resilience, discretion, and an unfailing sense of duty. The men noticed too. Prince William developed a deep appreciation for his aunt and uncle during this period. He saw how Edward supported him emotionally during Catherine's illness, how Sophie stepped in to handle royal duties that might otherwise have fallen to his ailing wife. The families grew closer, visiting each other's homes and sharing private dinners away from the cameras. A genuine affection developed, the kind that transcends mere duty or obligation. All of this happened against the backdrop of William's own evolving role. As heir to the throne, he was beginning to think seriously about what kind of king he wanted to be. His father's reign would be relatively short, given Charles's age at coronation. William knew that his time was coming, perhaps sooner than anyone expected. He needed to build a team around him, people he could trust absolutely when the weight of the crown finally settled on his head. The question was who would be part of that inner circle. His brother was gone, living across an ocean with seemingly no desire to return. His cousins had their own limitations and complications. But his Aunt Sophie? She had proven herself again and again. She was experienced, capable, and scandal-free. More importantly, William genuinely liked and trusted her. The decision was almost obvious, but making it official would require careful planning and potentially create tensions within the family. Because not everyone was thrilled about Sophie's rising star. Queen Camilla had her own position to protect, her own legacy to build. Having worked for decades to overcome her reputation as the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage, Camilla was sensitive to anyone who might threaten her standing. Sophie's connection to Diana's memory, her humanitarian work that echoed the late princess's most famous causes, created an uncomfortable parallel that some at court could not ignore. The palace is never just one entity with one view. It is a collection of households, each with its own staff, its own interests, and its own agenda. William's household at Kensington Palace sometimes clashed with his father's at Buckingham Palace. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, invisible to the public but very real to those who lived within the system. Any major shift in power dynamics would create winners and losers, and not everyone was prepared to lose. William understood these complexities. He had grown up watching palace politics play out in ways that had damaged his mother and nearly destroyed his family. He knew that making bold moves required not just courage but strategy. The pieces needed to be put in place carefully, alliances built and strengthened before the decisive moment arrived. And so he waited, watched, and planned, keeping his ultimate intentions close to his chest while Sophie continued her steady rise. The events of 2024 accelerated everything. Catherine's cancer diagnosis forced a reckoning with mortality and priority that left lasting marks on the entire family. Charles's own health battles added urgency to questions of succession and continuity. The old order was passing, and a new generation was preparing to take control. In this moment of transition, Sophie's years of quiet service were about to pay dividends that even she could not have anticipated. Because William had decided that when his time came, Sophie would be at the center of his modernized monarchy. She would have a role unlike anything seen before, a position that would require all her skills, all her experience, and all her proven loyalty. The plan was daring, perhaps even revolutionary by royal standards. It would change everything, not just for Sophie, but for the entire institution she had served so faithfully. And that plan was about to become public in the most dramatic way possible. The morning of April 29, 2024, began like any other at Buckingham Palace. Staff moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, preparing for another day of meetings and engagements. But this day would be different. This day would mark a turning point in Sophie's transformation from supporting player to central figure in the royal drama. Sophie was preparing for a journey that no member of the British royal family had dared to make since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. She was going to Kiev. The decision had been made weeks earlier, in quiet consultations between the palace, the Foreign Office, and security services. It was dangerous, unprecedented, and exactly the kind of mission that Sophie had come to specialize in. The plan was kept secret until the last possible moment. Even some members of the royal family did not know what was happening until Sophie was already in the air. Security concerns demanded absolute discretion, and Sophie understood the risks better than anyone. She had read the intelligence briefings, the reports of missile attacks and civilian casualties. She knew that entering an active war zone was not a symbolic gesture but a genuine act of courage. Her reasons for going were deeply personal. For years, Sophie had championed survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones. She had heard their stories in refugee camps across the world, looked into their eyes, and promised to be their voice in halls of power. Now, the same crimes were happening in Europe, just a few hours' flight from London. Ukrainian women were being raped as weapons of war, their trauma used to terrorize entire communities. Sophie could not stand by and do nothing. The plane landed in Poland, and, from there, Sophie made the crossing into Ukraine by road. The journey was tense, the landscape scarred by war. As she approached Kiev, she could see the evidence of destruction everywhere, bombed buildings, rubble in the streets, the faces of people who had seen too much. It was one thing to read about war in reports. It was another to witness its aftermath with your own eyes. Her first stop was Bucha, a suburb of Kiev that had become synonymous with atrocity. During the Russian occupation, hundreds of civilians had been killed there, many executed with their hands tied behind their backs. Bodies had been left in the streets for weeks. The world had recoiled in horror when images from Bucha first emerged, and now Sophie was walking the same streets, paying her respects to the dead. At a memorial site, Sophie lit a candle and stood in silence. A priest showed her photographs of those who had been killed, ordinary people whose only crime was living in the wrong place at the wrong time. Children, elderly, mothers, and fathers, their lives cut short by violence that served no purpose except cruelty. Sophie's face showed the strain of absorbing so much grief, but she did not look away. She had come to bear witness, and witness she would. Later, she met with survivors of sexual violence at a center run by the United Nations Population Fund. These were women who had experienced the worst that humans could do to each other, and they had found the courage to tell their stories. Sophie listened for hours, holding hands, offering words of comfort, and promising that their suffering would not be forgotten. She spoke about the need for accountability, for justice, for a world that protected the vulnerable instead of preying upon them. The highlight of the visit was her meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky and First Lady Alina Zelenska. Sophie delivered a personal message from King Charles, words of solidarity and support from the British Crown. The conversation covered many topics, including the role of women in Ukraine's recovery, the importance of international support, and the long road ahead toward peace. Zelensky expressed his gratitude for Britain's unwavering commitment, and for Sophie's willingness to come to his country when so many others stayed away. That evening, at the British ambassador's residence, Sophie gave a speech that captured everything she had seen and felt. She spoke about how women and girls pay the highest price in war, how rape is used as a weapon to demean, degrade, and destroy. Her voice was steady but emotional, the words of someone who truly understood the human cost of conflict. Those who heard her that night knew they were witnessing something significant, a royal using her platform not for ceremony but for justice. The reaction back in Britain was overwhelming. News of Sophie's secret trip broke across all media platforms, accompanied by images of her standing among the ruins of Bucha, meeting with Zelensky, comforting survivors. The public response was almost universally positive. Here was a member of the royal family doing something that actually mattered, taking real risks to stand with people in their darkest hour. It was exactly the kind of soft power diplomacy that the monarchy could offer at its best. Inside the palace, the calculus was shifting. Sophie's Ukraine visit demonstrated that she could handle the most sensitive assignments with grace and competence. She had represented the king in a war zone, delivered his message to a head of state, and generated positive coverage worldwide. This was not the work of a minor royal but of a senior diplomat, a trusted representative of the British crown at the highest levels. Prince William watched all of this with keen interest. He had always admired Sophie's humanitarian work, but Ukraine showed him something more. It showed him that she could operate independently, make good decisions under pressure, and enhance the monarchy's reputation through meaningful action. These were exactly the qualities he would need in his closest allies when he became king. The plan that had been forming in his mind began to take more definite shape. But William was not the only one paying attention. Queen Camilla also noticed Sophie's rising profile, and not entirely with pleasure. Camilla had her own position to maintain, her own causes to champion, and her own relationship with her husband the king. Sophie's emergence as a major figure complicated the landscape in ways that made some at court uncomfortable. The comparison to Princess Diana was impossible to ignore. Both women worked with vulnerable populations. Both showed a personal touch that connected with the public in ways that other royals struggled to match. Both were blonde, beautiful, and beloved by the cameras. For Camilla, who had spent decades trying to escape Diana's shadow, the parallels must have stung. Royal commentators began drawing explicit connections, suggesting that Sophie was carrying forward Diana's humanitarian legacy. Sophie herself tried to downplay any rivalry. She had spent 25 years learning how to navigate palace politics without creating enemies. She knew that her success depended on maintaining good relationships with everyone, including the Queen. When the two women appeared together at public events, they smiled warmly and chatted easily. Behind the scenes, sources insisted, they got along well despite their different roles and perspectives. But tensions have a way of surfacing, especially when the stakes are high. Reports began to emerge of subtle conflicts, not open warfare but quiet jockeying for position. Which royal would attend which event? Who would receive which patronage? How would the limited pool of attention and resources be divided among competing interests? These questions did not have easy answers, and the answers that were given did not always please everyone. King Charles tried to manage these dynamics with his characteristic style, praising all his family members while keeping the ultimate power in his own hands. He genuinely appreciated what Sophie and Edward brought to the monarchy, their reliability and work ethic and lack of scandal. But he also loved his wife and wanted her role as queen to be respected and supported. Balancing these interests required constant diplomatic effort. Meanwhile, Sophie continued her relentless schedule of engagements. She became patron of the Mothers' Union in February 2025, following in the footsteps of Queen Victoria, Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and Queen Elizabeth II. This was an honor reserved for the most senior female members of the royal family, a clear signal that Sophie's status was rising. She took on more international trips, representing the king in places as diverse as Japan, Peru, and Guatemala. Her trip to the Democratic Republic of the Congo in 2022 and again in 2025 put her in one of the most dangerous places on earth. She met with survivors of genocide and sexual violence, listening to stories that would haunt anyone with a conscience. She visited communities torn apart by conflict, seeing firsthand the devastation that war brings to the most vulnerable. Each trip added to her expertise, her credibility, and her reputation as someone willing to go where others feared to tread. Back home, Sophie's bond with Princess Catherine continued to deepen. The two women were seen together at Remembrance Sunday in November 2024, standing side by side on the balcony overlooking the cenotaph. It was one of Catherine's first public appearances since announcing her cancer diagnosis, and the strain was visible on her face. Sophie stood close, offering quiet support, at one point placing a reassuring hand on Catherine's back. The gesture was captured by photographers and circulated worldwide as evidence of the royal family's unity. This physical demonstration of care spoke volumes. Sophie understood what Catherine was going through because she had faced her own medical crisis. When Louise was born in 2003, Sophie had nearly bled to death from complications. She knew the terror of watching your life slip away, the slow process of recovery, the gratitude for each new day. She brought this understanding to her relationship with Catherine, offering the kind of support that only someone who has walked through the fire can provide. William noticed and appreciated this support more than he could express. His wife was battling cancer while raising 3 young children and facing the endless scrutiny of the press. She needed people around her who understood, who could be trusted, who would not add to her burdens with their own agendas. Sophie was one of those people, perhaps the most important one outside their immediate circle. William would not forget her kindness during this difficult time. The families began spending more time together. The Edinburghs would visit Adelaide Cottage, the Wales family home on the Windsor estate. The Wales family would sometimes drop by Bagshot Park, Sophie and Edward's residence in Surrey. The children played together, the adults talked about everything from parenting to palace life. A genuine friendship was forming, the kind that goes beyond mere family obligation. These private gatherings allowed William to share his thinking about the future with Edward and Sophie. He talked about his vision for a modernized monarchy, one that would be more relevant and connected to ordinary people. He spoke about the challenges he saw ahead, the need for trusted allies, the importance of having people who could handle responsibility without creating problems. He did not spell out exactly what he was planning, but the implications were clear enough for those listening carefully. Sophie, for her part, expressed her eagerness to serve in whatever capacity was needed. She had spent her career preparing for this moment, building skills and relationships that could now be put to greater use. She understood that the monarchy was at a crossroads, facing challenges that required fresh thinking and committed action. Whatever William asked of her, she would be ready. Edward also had his role to play. While Sophie attracted most of the public attention, Edward had been quietly strengthening his own position within the family. He had taken on the Duke of Edinburgh Award, his father Philip's famous youth program, ensuring its continuity and relevance. He had represented the king at events around the world, proving himself a reliable and dignified presence. Together, he and Sophie formed a partnership that William saw as essential to his future plans. The groundwork was being laid, piece by piece, for something momentous. William was building his team, identifying the people who would be closest to him when he wore the crown. The slimmed-down monarchy that his father advocated would need to function like a well-oiled machine, with every member pulling their weight and none creating distractions. Sophie had proven herself indispensable to this vision, and William was preparing to reward her accordingly. But making these changes would not be simple. The monarchy moved slowly, bound by centuries of tradition and protocol. Any significant shift in roles and responsibilities would require careful negotiation, not just within the family but with the government and the public. William would need to build support for his plans while avoiding the appearance of undercutting his father's reign. It was a delicate balance, the kind that required patience and political skill. The opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. In early 2025, reports began circulating that William was taking a more active role in palace decisions. Sources described him as seizing more power from his father, putting his foot down on several key issues. While some characterized this as tension between father and son, others saw it as natural preparation for an inevitable transition. Charles was in his mid-70s and had faced his own health challenges. It made sense for William to be more involved in planning the monarchy's future. One of the decisions William was pushing for involved giving lesser-known royals more of a spotlight. This included not just Sophie and Edward but potentially their children as well. Lady Louise and James had been raised out of the public eye, without using their HRH titles, but they could be called upon if needed. William was thinking generationally, planning not just for his own reign but for the decades that would follow. The Times newspaper ran a story in January 2025 that made William's intentions clearer. Palace sources told the paper that William and Catherine got on very well with the Edinburghs, and that William would be eager for his aunt and uncle to play a more prominent role in public life. The source hinted at a major role for Sophie in particular, without specifying exactly what that role might be. Royal watchers immediately began speculating about what this could mean. Could Sophie become a kind of roving ambassador for the crown, handling the most sensitive diplomatic missions? Could she take on ceremonial duties that would otherwise fall to the king or heir? Could she be given a position within William's household that would formalize her importance? All of these possibilities were discussed in the press and on social media, but no one knew for certain what William had in mind. What everyone did know was that something was changing. The dynamics of the royal family were shifting in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. A woman who had entered the family as a commoner, who had survived scandal and near death, who had worked quietly for decades without recognition, was now being positioned as a central figure in the monarchy's future. Sophie's moment was arriving, and she was ready to seize it. The announcement, when it finally came, would stun the world and shake the foundations of the palace. It would elevate Sophie to heights no one had imagined and force everyone, including Queen Camilla, to reckon with a new reality. But, before that moment arrived, there was more drama to unfold, more alliances to test, and more challenges to overcome. The story of Sophie's rise was far from over. The palace corridors whispered with rumors through the winter months of 2024 and into 2025. Staff members exchanged knowing glances, wondering what changes lay ahead. Those closest to the inner workings of the monarchy sensed that something significant was brewing, even if they could not quite put their finger on what it was. Prince William had been holding more meetings than usual, consulting with advisors about matters that went beyond the normal business of his household. Sophie continued her public duties without any visible change in her routine. She appeared at events, shook hands with dignitaries, and championed her various causes. But those who knew her well noticed a new confidence in her bearing, a subtle shift in how she carried herself. She seemed to know something that others did not, and she was biding her time with the patience she had cultivated over 25 years of royal service. Her humanitarian work continued to expand in scope and ambition. In late 2025, she traveled to Central and South America on a 9-day diplomatic mission. The trip took her to Peru, Panama, Guatemala, and Belize, meeting with government officials and civil society leaders. In each country, she focused on issues affecting women and children, particularly those trapped in cycles of violence and poverty. The local press covered her visits extensively, marveling at this British royal who seemed genuinely interested in their struggles. In Guatemala, Sophie shared a luncheon with a group of women leaders organized by the British ambassador. She listened as they described the challenges they faced, including promoting equality, strengthening civic participation, and creating opportunities for future generations. Sophie asked thoughtful questions and shared her own experiences of advocating for change within the constraints of her position. The women were impressed by her authenticity and her evident commitment to making a difference. Back in London, Queen Camilla was dealing with her own challenges. A chest infection had forced her to miss several engagements in November 2024, including some of the Remembrance Weekend events. In her absence, Sophie had stepped into the breach, standing beside Catherine at the cenotaph ceremony. The optics were striking, the two younger women representing the royal family while the Queen recovered at home. Some observers could not help but wonder if this was a preview of things to come. Camilla was not oblivious to these dynamics. She had fought too hard for too long to be sidelined now. Her journey from the most hated woman in Britain to the accepted queen consort was one of the great rehabilitation stories in modern royal history. She had earned her place through decades of steadfast support for Charles, through countless public appearances where she smiled through criticism and abuse. She was not about to let anyone, even the hard-working Sophie, diminish what she had achieved. The two women continued to appear together at events, putting on a united front for the cameras. In November 2025, they attended the biennial Rifles Awards dinner at the City of London Guildhall together. Camilla wore a stunning floor-length blood red velvet gown, while Sophie chose an elegant navy ensemble with silver accessories. They chatted warmly as they mingled with military personnel and veterans, giving no hint of any tension between them. To the outside world, they seemed like colleagues who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But palace insiders knew that the relationship was more complicated than it appeared. Camilla and Sophie had different constituencies within the royal family and the public. Camilla drew her support primarily from her husband the king, who loved her deeply and wanted her role to be respected. Sophie's support came from a broader base, including the late Queen Elizabeth, Prince William, and a growing section of the public who admired her humanitarian work. These overlapping but distinct power bases created potential for conflict. The question of who would lead the royal women after Camilla's time added another layer of complexity. Princess Anne was older than Camilla and showed no signs of slowing down, but she operated largely independently and had never sought a leadership role beyond her own extensive portfolio. Catherine was the obvious heir apparent among the women, but her cancer recovery had left questions about what she could handle. Sophie filled a middle ground, experienced enough to lead but not so prominent as to threaten those above her. Royal expert Sean Smith described Sophie as bridging the gap between the generations. At 60, she was placed almost exactly in the middle of Catherine's age and both Anne and Camilla's. This made her a unique figure who could connect the older and younger members of the monarchy, translating between their different perspectives and priorities. It was a role that required diplomatic skill and emotional intelligence, qualities that Sophie had in abundance. Her connection to Princess Diana's legacy continued to generate both admiration and discomfort in certain quarters. Sophie's work with survivors of sexual violence in conflict zones echoed Diana's famous advocacy for landmine victims through the Halo Trust. Both women had used their positions to shine light on issues that others preferred to ignore. Both had shown a personal touch that made people feel seen and valued. The parallels were not lost on anyone, least of all those who had complicated feelings about Diana's memory. Royal commentator Katie Nicholl drew explicit comparisons between the two women. She noted that they were both blonde and beautiful, but, more importantly, they shared a commitment to groundbreaking and often dangerous work. Where Diana had walked through minefields, Sophie walked through war zones. Where Diana had embraced AIDS patients when others feared to touch them, Sophie embraced rape survivors when others looked away. The comparison was flattering to Sophie but uncomfortable for those whose relationship with Diana's ghost remained troubled. Through all of this, Sophie maintained her characteristic composure. She never responded to speculation about rivalries or positioning. She never gave interviews that could be seen as promoting herself at others' expense. She simply continued doing her job, day after day, building a record of service that spoke louder than any words could. Her strategy was patience, her weapon was consistency, and her secret was genuine commitment to the causes she championed. Prince William observed these dynamics with growing appreciation. He saw how Sophie handled the pressures of palace life without creating drama. He noticed how she navigated the delicate relationships with other family members while staying true to her own values. He recognized in her the qualities that he most wanted in his own team: reliability, discretion, competence, and absolute loyalty. The more he watched, the more certain he became that his plan was right. The conversations between William and Sophie became more frequent and more substantive. They discussed the challenges facing the monarchy in the 21st century, the need to modernize while respecting tradition, the importance of connecting with younger generations who questioned the relevance of royal institutions. Sophie shared insights from her decades of experience, while William outlined his vision for the future. They were thinking together, planning together, preparing for a new era. Edward was part of these discussions as well. Though often overshadowed by his wife's public profile, Edward brought his own valuable perspective to the table. He understood the pressures of being a royal son who was not the heir, the constant comparisons, the need to find one's own way. He had managed the Duke of Edinburgh Award for years, connecting with young people and understanding their aspirations. He was a steadying presence who complemented Sophie's dynamism. The family bond between the Edinburghs and the Wales household continued to strengthen. They were neighbors, practically speaking, with Sophie and Edward at Bagshot Park and William and Catherine soon moving to Forest Lodge in Windsor Great Park. The geographical proximity made informal visits easy, and the children of both families grew comfortable with each other. Lady Louise, now at the University of St. Andrews where William and Catherine had famously met, was developing her own relationship with her younger cousins. Princess Charlotte seemed particularly drawn to her great-aunt Sophie. They had been spotted on shopping outings together, and sources described a warm connection between them. Catherine was said to be touched by the relationship, grateful that her daughter had such a positive female role model in the family beyond her own mother and grandmother. Sophie, for her part, clearly delighted in being able to spend time with the next generation of royals. These personal connections reinforced the professional alliance that was forming. William trusted Sophie not just as a colleague but as a member of the family who had proven her loyalty through actions over many years. He knew that when the time came to make changes, Sophie would support him unreservedly. He also knew that her support would matter, both within the family and in the wider public perception of his leadership. The question of what exactly William was planning remained a subject of intense speculation. Royal watchers analyzed every photograph, every quote, every subtle change in protocol for clues about what might be coming. Some predicted that Sophie would be given a formal title or position that recognized her increased responsibilities. Others suggested that she might take on specific portfolios that had previously been handled by the King or Prince of Wales. Still others thought the changes might be more symbolic, a public acknowledgement of her importance without necessarily creating new structures. What everyone agreed on was that change was coming. The monarchy was facing challenges that required fresh thinking and new approaches. Climate change, social inequality, cultural divisions, and questions of relevance all demanded attention. The old ways of doing things might not be enough to sustain public support for an institution that many viewed as outdated and out of touch. William understood this, and he was determined to adapt. His vision for the future included a more diverse and representative monarchy, one that reflected the Britain of today rather than the Britain of his grandmother's coronation in 1953. He wanted a monarchy that was accessible and approachable, that connected with ordinary people in meaningful ways. He believed that Sophie embodied these values better than almost anyone else in the family, and he wanted her to be a visible part of his reformed institution. But making these changes required careful groundwork. William needed to build consensus within the family, to bring along those who might resist or resent any alterations to the status quo. He needed to prepare the public for what was coming, to create expectations that his plans would fulfill. And he needed to time everything perfectly, neither moving too fast nor waiting too long. The dance of royal politics required patience and precision in equal measure. As 2025 progressed, the pieces began falling into place. William's conversations with his father about the future became more detailed and concrete. Charles, for his part, seemed willing to give his son room to shape the monarchy that he would eventually inherit. The king understood that he would not reign as long as his mother had, and he wanted to ensure a smooth transition when the time came. If that meant empowering William to make some decisions now, so be it. The relationship between father and son was not always easy. There were moments of tension, disagreements about timing and priorities, different views about how fast change should come. But underlying it all was a shared commitment to the institution they both served. Charles and William might have different styles, but they agreed on the fundamental importance of the monarchy to British national life. They would find a way to work together. Sophie watched these developments with quiet satisfaction. She had positioned herself exactly where she needed to be, trusted by both the current king and the future one. Her decades of patient service were finally paying off in ways that she could never have predicted when she first walked through palace doors as a nervous girlfriend all those years ago. The shy girl from Kent had become an indispensable figure at the heart of the royal family. The moment of truth was approaching. William had made his decision, consulted with those who needed to be consulted, and prepared the ground for what was coming. The announcement would be dramatic, a clear signal that a new era was dawning for the House of Windsor. Sophie would be at the center of this transformation, elevated to a position that recognized her true value to the monarchy. And Queen Camilla, whatever her private feelings might be, would have to accept a new reality. The stage was set for the most significant restructuring of royal roles in decades. The fivefold impact of William's decision to elevate Sophie's role was felt across every corner of the royal establishment. Each ripple touched different aspects of palace life, public perception, and the monarchy's future trajectory. Understanding these impacts requires examining them one by one, seeing how each change connected to the others in a web of consequences that would reshape the House of Windsor for generations to come. The first impact was on Sophie herself and her immediate family. For years, the Edinburghs had operated as reliable but relatively minor figures in the royal hierarchy. They did their work without fanfare, received modest media attention, and lived relatively private lives compared to the more senior members. William's plan changed all of that overnight. Sophie was suddenly a central figure in discussions about the monarchy's future, her every move analyzed and debated by experts and the public alike. This new visibility brought both opportunities and pressures. Sophie could now command larger platforms for her humanitarian causes, drawing attention to issues that mattered deeply to her. Her work on conflict-related sexual violence, which had previously received sporadic coverage, became front-page news when she spoke about it. Organizations she supported saw increased donations and volunteer interest. Her voice carried further than ever before, amplifying the messages she had been trying to deliver for decades. But visibility also meant scrutiny. Every outfit, every gesture, every word was now subject to interpretation and criticism. Sophie had experienced this before, during the early years of her marriage when tabloids seemed determined to find fault with everything she did. She had learned from those experiences, developing a thick skin and a philosophy of not reading what was written about her. Now she would need all of that resilience as the spotlight intensified beyond anything she had previously known. Edward too felt the effects of his wife's elevation. He had always been the less prominent partner in their marriage, content to support Sophie while pursuing his own interests in the arts and youth development. Now he was pulled into more high-profile engagements, expected to match his wife's increased workload. The Duke of Edinburgh title he had inherited from his father carried greater weight than ever, and he felt the responsibility keenly. He rose to the challenge, appearing alongside Sophie at major events and representing the king with growing confidence. Their children faced their own adjustments. Lady Louise, now 21 and studying at St. Andrews, found herself mentioned in articles about the future of the monarchy. Would she become a working royal? Would she take on HRH status that her parents had declined for her at birth? These questions, which had seemed theoretical for years, suddenly had real implications for her future choices. She had to decide what kind of life she wanted while the world watched and speculated. James, the Earl of Wessex at 17, was even younger and less prepared for public attention. He had grown up largely shielded from the media, attending school and pursuing his interests away from the spotlight. Now his name appeared in discussions about which cousins Prince William might call upon for support during his reign. The quiet life his parents had tried to give him was becoming harder to maintain. The second impact fell on the broader structure of the working royal family. William's decision to elevate Sophie implicitly raised questions about everyone else's position. If Sophie was rising, who might be falling? The calculus of royal importance is always relative, a zero-sum game where any increase for one person seems to diminish others. Those who might feel threatened by Sophie's new status had to decide how to respond. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, was perhaps the least affected. She had carved out her own space decades ago and showed no interest in competing with anyone for attention or status. Her approach to royal duties was unique, relentlessly hardworking and utterly without pretense. She would continue doing exactly what she had always done, regardless of what changes occurred around her. If anything, she seemed quietly pleased to see another woman rising on the basis of solid work rather than glamour or drama. The Dukes of Gloucester and Kent, along with their families, were more peripheral but still felt the implications. These older members of the extended royal family had provided quiet support for decades, filling in at events when senior royals were unavailable. William's emphasis on a slimmed-down monarchy raised questions about their future roles. Would there still be space for them when he became king? The uncertainty was unsettling for families that had devoted their lives to service. The third impact centered on Queen Camilla and her position within the family hierarchy. This was perhaps the most sensitive area, the one that required the most careful management. Camilla had worked incredibly hard to rehabilitate her reputation and establish herself as a respected queen consort. Any perception that she was being overshadowed or sidelined would be damaging both to her personally and to the harmony of the royal family. William was careful to frame Sophie's elevation in ways that did not directly challenge Camilla's status. The changes were about the future, about preparing for William's own reign, rather than about the present structure under King Charles. Sophie herself went out of her way to show deference to the Queen, never stepping ahead of her at joint events and always emphasizing her loyalty to both Charles and Camilla. The goal was enhancement, not competition. Still, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Camilla's allies in the palace watched Sophie's rise with concern, worrying about what it meant for their patron. There were quiet conversations about whether the balance of power was shifting too fast, whether William was overreaching by making these moves while his father still sat on the throne. The palace is never free of politics, and this period was no exception. Reports emerged of efforts to manage the relationship between the two women. They were scheduled to appear together at carefully chosen events, demonstrating unity for the cameras. Their shared interests in women's issues and literacy provided common ground for collaboration. Aides from both households worked to prevent any public perception of rivalry, knowing how destructive such stories could be. The memory of the supposed conflict between Diana and Camilla was still fresh enough to serve as warning. The fourth impact related to the monarchy's public image and relevance. William's decision to elevate Sophie was part of a broader strategy to modernize the institution, making it more relatable to ordinary people. By highlighting a woman who had entered the family from a middle-class background and risen through dedicated service, he was sending a message about what the monarchy could and should be. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Polls showed that Sophie was increasingly popular, with approval ratings that rivaled or exceeded some more senior royals. People appreciated her work ethic, her genuine compassion, and her lack of scandal. She seemed like someone you might actually want to know, rather than an untouchable figure behind palace walls. This accessibility was exactly what William believed the monarchy needed to survive in the modern age. Media coverage reflected this changing perception. Where Sophie had once been an afterthought in royal reporting, she was now a regular subject of features and profiles. Her fashion choices were analyzed, her public statements were quoted, and her humanitarian trips were covered in detail. She handled this attention with the skill of someone who had spent decades in public relations before becoming a royal. She knew how to give the press enough material to satisfy their appetite while protecting her privacy and that of her family. The comparison to younger social media celebrities was inevitable. Could the monarchy compete for attention in an age of instant content and fleeting fame? Sophie represented a different model, one of sustained commitment rather than viral moments. Her appeal was built over years, not captured in a single post. William believed this deeper connection would prove more durable than the shallow engagement that dominated modern media. The fifth and final impact concerned the future itself, the long-term transformation of the monarchy that William was trying to achieve. Sophie's elevation was not just about recognizing her past service but about positioning her for even greater responsibilities ahead. When William became king, he wanted her at the center of his team, handling challenges that had not yet emerged and representing the crown in ways that could not yet be imagined. This forward-looking aspect of the decision was perhaps the most significant. William was thinking in decades, not months or years. He was building an institution that would serve Britain through the 21st century and beyond. He needed people he could trust absolutely, who shared his vision and would work tirelessly to achieve it. Sophie had proven herself in every way that mattered. She was his choice, and he was prepared to back that choice with real power and responsibility. The implications for the next generation were profound. By elevating Sophie and, potentially her children, William was creating a template for how cousins and extended family members could contribute to the monarchy. He was rejecting the sharp divide between working and non-working royals that had excluded people like Peter Phillips and Zara Tindall from formal roles. He was imagining a more flexible structure that could draw on talent wherever it existed within the family. Lady Louise was watching all of this with particular interest. She had grown up understanding that she would likely need to work for a living, that a traditional royal career was not in her future. Now the possibilities were opening up in unexpected ways. She could choose to become a working royal if she wished, taking on the HRH title and the responsibilities that came with it. Or she could remain private, supporting the family from behind the scenes. The choice would be hers, but the choice itself was new. Through all 5 of these impacts, Sophie navigated with her characteristic calm. She did not seek the spotlight but did not shrink from it either. She continued doing the work she had always done, visiting charities, meeting with dignitaries, advocating for vulnerable populations around the world. The elevation of her status did not change who she was at core. It simply gave her more tools to pursue the goals she had held for decades. The stunned reaction from Queen Camilla was not visible in public, but those close to the palace understood its significance. Camilla was a pragmatist above all else. She had survived the Diana years, the public hatred, the long wait for Charles to become king. She knew how to adapt to changing circumstances, how to find her footing on shifting ground. If Sophie's rise was inevitable, Camilla would find a way to work with it rather than against it. The 2 women continued appearing together at events, their smiles genuine if perhaps more complicated than they once were. They shared causes and, occasionally collaborated on initiatives. The surface harmony was maintained, even as the underlying power dynamics evolved. Both understood that open conflict would harm the monarchy they both served. Both were smart enough to avoid that trap. As the initial shock of William's announcement faded, a new normal began to emerge. Sophie was now a fixture at the highest levels of royal activity, no longer a supporting player but a leading figure. Her calendar filled with engagements that would once have gone to more senior royals. Her voice carried weight in discussions about policy and direction. She had arrived at the destination she had been traveling toward for 25 years, and she was ready to make the most of it. The fivefold impact would continue reverberating through the years ahead, shaping the monarchy in ways that only time would fully reveal. What was already clear was that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The House of Windsor was transforming before the world's eyes, led by a prince with a vision and powered by a duchess who had finally claimed her place in history. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Windsor Castle as Sophie prepared for another day of service. It had been months since the announcement that changed everything, and yet some mornings she still had to remind herself that it was all real. The girl who had grown up in a modest home in Kent, who had worked as a radio secretary and PR executive, who had fallen in love with a prince and nearly died bringing his daughter into the world, was now one of the most important women in Britain. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her dress and thinking about the day ahead. There would be meetings with charity representatives, a briefing on her upcoming trip to East Africa, and a private dinner with William and Catherine to discuss strategy for the coming months. The schedule was relentless, but Sophie would not have it any other way. She had spent too many years waiting in the wings to complain now that she was on center stage. Edward came up behind her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. They had been married for over 25 years, and their partnership had only grown stronger with time. He was her anchor, the person who kept her grounded when the pressures of royal life threatened to overwhelm her. Together they had weathered scandals, health crises, family dramas, and the constant glare of public attention. They had emerged from it all more united than ever. Their children were growing into their own identities. Louise had developed a quiet confidence at university, handling the increased attention with the same grace her mother had taught by example. She was still deciding what her future would hold, whether she would embrace a formal royal role or pursue a more private path. Either way, Sophie and Edward would support her completely. They had always believed in letting their children find their own way. James was maturing too, showing flashes of his mother's warmth and his father's steady temperament. The Earl of Wessex was no longer a child but a young man preparing for whatever life might bring. His parents had shielded him as much as possible, but they knew that some exposure to public duties would be necessary. He was handling it better than they had dared hope. The transformation of Sophie's role had rippled outward in ways that continued to surprise her. Organizations she had worked with for years suddenly found themselves with higher profiles and increased resources. The causes she championed received attention they had never gotten before. Her voice on issues like sexual violence in conflict zones carried further than ever, reaching audiences that could actually make a difference. The platform William had given her was being used exactly as she had always hoped. Her relationship with Princess Catherine had deepened into something truly special. They spoke regularly, sharing concerns about their children, their work, and the unique pressures they both faced. Catherine's recovery from cancer was proceeding well, and she was gradually taking on more public duties. Sophie served as both confidant and colleague, offering support while respecting Catherine's need to set her own pace. Their friendship was one of the great blessings of Sophie's life. The bond with William had evolved as well. What had begun as a nephew-aunt relationship had become a genuine partnership, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the monarchy's future. William trusted Sophie's judgment completely, often seeking her input on decisions that would have seemed above her pay grade just a few years earlier. She never overstepped, never presumed too much, but, when asked, she offered advice that William found invaluable. The relationship with King Charles remained warm and appreciative. Charles understood what Sophie brought to the table and was grateful for her tireless service. He had supported William's decision to elevate her, recognizing that the monarchy needed every capable hand it could find. The loss of Harry and Meghan, the disgrace of Andrew, the aging of the senior royals, all of these factors made people like Sophie essential to the institution's survival. Queen Camilla had, to her credit, adapted to the new reality with characteristic practicality. The two women had found a working rhythm that allowed them to pursue their own agendas while cooperating on shared interests. There were still moments of awkwardness, echoes of the tensions that had simmered during the transition, but they were becoming less frequent. Both women understood that unity served everyone better than conflict. The comparison to Princess Diana continued to surface in media coverage, and Sophie had learned to accept it with grace. She knew that she was walking paths Diana had walked, championing causes Diana had championed, embodying values that Diana had brought to the monarchy. Rather than feeling burdened by the comparison, Sophie drew inspiration from it. Diana had shown what was possible when a royal connected authentically with ordinary people. Sophie was proving that the lesson had been learned. Her humanitarian work continued to expand in scope and ambition. The trip to Ukraine in 2024 had been just the beginning. Since then, she had traveled to conflict zones across the world, meeting with survivors and advocates who were fighting for justice and healing. Each trip added to her expertise and her credibility, making her an increasingly powerful voice on issues of violence against women and children in war. At home, she focused on causes that were closer to everyday concerns. Her work with the Mothers' Union connected her with women across Britain who were facing ordinary struggles, the kind that never made headlines but mattered enormously to those experiencing them. She visited schools and hospitals, community centers and care homes, bringing attention and resources wherever she went. She had learned from the Queen, the late Elizabeth, that small acts of connection were as important as grand gestures. The question of what would happen when William became king hung over everything. Charles was in his mid-70s and facing his own health challenges. While he remained active and engaged, everyone understood that the transition could come sooner than expected. William was preparing intensively, and Sophie was part of those preparations. She would be ready when the moment arrived, ready to serve a new king just as faithfully as she had served his father and grandmother. The slimmed-down monarchy that William envisioned would require everyone to work harder and smarter. There would be fewer royals handling more responsibilities, covering more ground, and representing the crown in more situations. Sophie's elevation was part of this restructuring, a recognition that capability should trump lineage in determining who did what. She had proven herself through decades of service, and she would continue proving herself for as long as she was able. The children of the Wales family would eventually take their places in this new structure. George, Charlotte, and Louis were still young, but their futures were being shaped by the decisions being made now. William wanted them to have allies they could trust, aunts and uncles and cousins who understood the unique pressures of royal life. Sophie and Edward would be part of that network, the wise elders who could offer guidance when it was needed. Lady Louise's own future remained an open question. She might choose to become a working royal, embracing the HRH title and the responsibilities that came with it. Or she might prefer a more private existence, supporting the family from behind the scenes while pursuing her own career. William had made clear that either choice would be respected, that there would be no pressure to follow any particular path. The decision would be Louise's alone. As Sophie completed her preparations and headed downstairs for her first meeting of the day, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. She had never sought fame or power. She had simply tried to do her job well, to support her husband and family, to serve causes she believed in. The recognition that had come was gratifying but also humbling. She knew that many people worked just as hard without ever receiving such rewards. The monarchy itself was at a crossroads. Public support remained solid but not unconditional. Each generation had to prove anew that the institution deserved its privileged place in national life. Sophie believed passionately that it did, that a constitutional monarchy provided stability and continuity that served Britain well. But she also believed that the monarchy had to evolve, had to connect with new generations, had to justify its existence through service rather than merely asserting it through tradition. William shared this view, and together they were working to make it reality. The changes he had initiated were just the beginning of a longer transformation that would unfold over years and decades. Sophie would be part of that transformation for as long as she had strength to contribute. It was the role she had been preparing for her entire adult life, even if she had not always known where the path would lead. The stunned reaction to William's announcement had faded into acceptance and even appreciation. People could see that Sophie was delivering on the promise her elevation implied. She was working harder than ever, traveling farther, championing causes more effectively, and representing the crown with dignity and warmth. The critics who had questioned William's decision were being proven wrong day by day. As for what came next, only time would tell. The monarchy had survived for over 1,000 years by adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining its core identity. Sophie's rise was part of that adaptation, a response to the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. She was helping to write the next chapter of a very old story, adding her voice to a chorus that stretched back through generations. The girl from Kent had traveled an unimaginable distance to reach this moment. She had overcome prejudice and scandal, health crises and personal tragedy, years of being overlooked and undervalued. Now she stood at the heart of the British monarchy, trusted by its future king, beloved by the public, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Her story was far from over, but this chapter had reached its triumphant conclusion. Prince William's daring move had paid off beyond anyone's expectations. By elevating Sophie, he had demonstrated his vision for a monarchy that valued dedication over pedigree, action over ceremony, genuine connection over empty tradition. The fivefold impact of his decision had transformed not just Sophie's position but the institution itself, opening possibilities that had seemed closed and charting a course toward a future that honored the past while embracing what was to come. And, at the center of it all stood Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, the royal family's secret weapon who was secret no more. She had earned her place through a quarter-century of service, and she would spend whatever time remained to her continuing that service. It was the only life she had ever wanted, now that she had discovered it, and she would give it everything she had. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows of Windsor Castle as Sophie stepped out to meet her next challenge. Behind her lay decades of preparation. Before her lay the future of the monarchy. She was ready for both, and the world was watching to see what she would do next. This was her moment, and she intended to make the most of it.